Hello, everyone. Welcome to Starfleet Tactical. I am Chris Weave, as always, and I also have with me Pat Doyle, as always. And we have a guest tonight. This is Chris Carlson. I'll give a little bit more of an introduction to him in just a second, but we don't have Alec because Alec is still in the land of no subspace communications. Hopefully he'll be able to join us at some point, but we'll see how that all works out. So in any event, as I said, we've got a guest here, Chris Carlson. So you've probably heard me reference Chris a couple of times. He's the co-designer of the wargame Harpoon. Along with his writing partner, Larry Bond, write a whole bunch of novels that only have Larry's name on the cover, which is left over from when Chris was an intel analyst working for the government. And Chris is actually the guy who hired me to be his replacement when he decided to take early retirement because he didn't want to move to Charlottesville, Virginia. And so the end result of that is that if you read a bunch of Larry's novels that have Larry's name on the cover, it will say in big bold letters in the acknowledgments, Chris Carlson is the co-author of all this stuff. He wrote just as much as I did, et cetera, but his name's not on the cover. So welcome, Chris.
Good evening.
So
let's talk about something more fun.
Yeah, so Chris is here because Chris and Pat and I have been having, mostly actually Chris and Pat, have been having a long conversation about the Akira over the course of last week. Pat and Chris actually live fairly close to each other. You guys are both in the same ROTC unit, but like 15 years apart, right? Do I have that correct?
A little bit apart. Yeah, I graduated December of '93.
Okay, it was only 11 years.
Okay. So they, Chris is a retired naval reservist, and now he's just doing games and books full time and stuff like that. So he's able to just sort of do all that stuff. So last week, well, I guess first of all, let's sort of see how everybody's doing. How's your week been?
Good. I got to spend the week flying, and I actually spent on one of them. I had a 36-hour layover in Wausau, Wisconsin. But actually, they have some really good restaurants there. We ate at a Vietnamese restaurant, and I'm telling you, it was the best. Some of the best food that I have had. They had the pho. Which is broth and noodles and some meat and other stuff thrown in there. My son ordered orange chicken, and Linda ordered something else that was more of kind of a coconut base and stuff with it. Fantastic. Like next date night, it would not. We might theoretically just hop on a plane and fly to Wausau to go to dinner, or drive in the car, or drive 2 hours to go there for dinner. It was that good. So. Anyways, that was the highlight. That was one of the highlights of my week.
So what'd you have for dinner tonight, Pat?
I haven't had dinner yet. It's actually waiting upstairs for me.
Pat had made the comment before we started that dinner was running a little late, and he can smell this really great corned beef, but he can't eat any of it. He's going to the show instead. So how about you, Chris? How was your week?
It's been busy. Larry and I are working on a China supplement for Harpoon, and trying to figure out what the Chinese are doing is a painful process.
Yeah, they don't publish everything like the Russians do.
And this is true. This is true. I mean, the Russians, up until the last 5 years, there was a couple of guys that I'm absolutely surprised they're not in a gulag somewhere. With what they've published. It's like, oh, would have been nice to have known that back in the day. So, but the Chinese are one, they're somewhat cryptic, and two, we're going through Google Translate, so that's cryptic squared. So, things get weird.
So one time after Chris had retired, I gave him a call. And I forget exactly what we were talking about, but Chris says, "Oh yeah, I found all this stuff, et cetera, et cetera." And he's giving me this rundown on all this stuff that he had found on some system or another. And I sort of said something to the effect of, of, Chris, you're retired now. You don't have to be an intel analyst anymore. And his response was, I retired so I could go back to being an intel analyst.
That management stuff in the federal government is painful.
Yes. It's not what you originally signed up to do.
I got lucky. I had what a friend of mine described, who was also in this category, that the best job in the intelligence community is a non-supervisory GS-14. Because you're senior enough that they basically, your superiors will just say, go forth and do good work and tell me about it when you're done. So roger that. I'm out.
I was non-supervisory, and every time they drafted me, I kept pointing to this in my job description. Said, "Oh, no problem. We'll waive it." Thanks.
There's a waiver for everything.
Yeah, they drafted me to be the acting division chief 3 times.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh.
It's shocking how much more work it is to try to figure out what other people need to be doing.
Well, and then, then you find out that, if you're reasonably competent with things like award packages and whatnot, all of a sudden, you're now the directorate representative to the awards board. How did that happen?
You made the mistake of being competent.
Yeah, yes, I know.
And for those of you out there who are listening to all of this and going like, oh, this just shows you how screwed up the government is, it's just like this in the civilian side too. It really isn't any, I spent 10 years, well, let's see, in the 1990s, I spent 1 year as a temp at the Postal Service, but the entire rest of my time in the 1990s was working for private companies, and it was the same there. The difference is we just didn't have any budget for a lot of stuff. It was actually worse in a lot of ways. Like I kept saying things like, in technical support, the average lifetime of a tech support rep is about 14 months. That's about how long you do it before you start running around screaming mad with, running around with scissors and stuff like that. And so like maybe what we should do, and so what ends up happening is they end up getting hired usually by the sales guys to be sales engineers. And since we were a growing company, it's like we're always going to need a steady input of people doing that. So why don't we plan on people lasting about 14 months and hire a new person at the 14-month mark? Because otherwise what ends up, or maybe even the 12-month mark, because what ends up happening is the person leaves and then everybody's workload goes up until you get the new guy on board and trained. And so there's always this like 4-month gap before the workload goes down again. And as a result, you're burning out the rest of your people. So if we start hiring early, maybe we can extend that from 14 months to 18 months, and we'll end up, cycling through less people. Nope. Deaf ears. Nope. Not.
It's more fun to just be reactionary.
More fun to just be reactionary. And it was always funny because when we get a new person, we need to have a new computer. They need a computer. And the policy in that department was when you bought a new computer, it went to the most senior person. And then his computer went to the second most senior person. And so every time you hired a new person, everybody got a newer computer. And it just sort of boom, 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 all the way down to the bottom. And it's like, why don't we just buy some new computers? No, I can't.
That would mean spending money.
It would mean spending money. Yeah, Jim Westbrook says, as a tech support rep myself, I can confirm that. Yeah, I was a frontline tech support person. So I ended up moving into more of a supervisory role and stuff. But I did tech support for a total of 6 years. First line, then second line, then third line. So, yeah, I earned my time. So, oh well. Let's see. My week went relatively well. It was a busy week. Got a reasonable amount done until today. I spent, let's see, I think I spent a total of about an hour and a half on the phone with Pat, and I spent 2 hours on the phone with Chris. So that was 3.5 of the 5.5 hours I spent on the phone today. So I think I'm done with that because it's late in the day, but who knows? Got a lot done on those calls. Some of them were projects that I've got in the works, like Chris and I talked about a wargaming project that we're both working on, that the ball's actually in my court on. And I'm also running a wargaming conference in April, and so an hour of that was talking with somebody who's going to help me with that. And so it was a productive day, but none of those things, I guess the talking to Brant was on my list of things to do today, but none of the rest of it was on my list of things to do today. So chewed up a lot of my day. But we're here now, and we're going to talk about the Akira. Pat has done a tactical analysis of it. We're going to go through that. And Chris has got some thoughts on the engineering. He is an engineer by training. And so we're going to have a discussion about that. So I guess, Pat, we're ready to start with you.
All right. Sounds good.
Ah, Wright says he worked for Earthlink. I remember Earthlink.
Okay. Can everybody see the presentation? Let's see. Actually, hang on a second. I think I picked the wrong screen.
I think you did too.
All right. That screen. There we go. And we'll do that. All right. How's that?
Can't see it.
Really?
Oh, here it comes.
Okay. Everybody should see Akira class capabilities, part 2.
So much for your French.
It's the best I can do on short notice.
Better than mine.
So anyways.
Before we start, my brother points out, nothing that anybody says is the opinion of any employer, past, present, future, alternate dimension, anything like that, right? So, yeah, exactly. So this is not the opinion of my current employer. My current employer I don't think even knows that I do this. To the best of my knowledge, they don't have an opinion on starships, although the current employer is much more likely to have an opinion on starships than the last employer did. So, for what it's worth. By the way, Chris, I told the story in another talk I did. I told the story of how when I told public affairs at DIA that I was going to be in a show about alien invasions and how they just lost their shit over that.
Yeah, I can see it.
They just went nuts. So, in any event, back to you, Pat.
Okay, so this is part 2. Last week we talked about the Akira class. We kind of speculated on, pointed out the photon torpedo tubes and where they might be. We we talked a little bit about its flight deck or carrier capabilities and stuff like that. So today what we're going to really focus on are advantages and disadvantages. So if you haven't seen this one yet, go back to last week's episode and watch that one. And that's the first half of this. And then today will be the second half. And we'll talk about advantages and disadvantages of the Akira, emphasizing that you don't get something for nothing. And then we'll talk about some tactical scenarios that the Akira could prove very useful in. So but to just briefly say, the Akira is seen as potentially a through deck carrier, meaning that entire saucer houses a hangar that is capable of launching the Peregrine fighters. And we do see in DS9 that there are peregrines floating around, but we just don't see any. We don't see who's bringing the peregrines along. I would imagine it's Galaxy and Akira's bringing a lot of the peregrines along, and probably anybody else with a hangar bay to some degree. The other thing is the Akira has about 15 to 17 photon torpedo tubes. And so it's a torpedo boat. So it carries lots of photon torpedoes. And in the last episode, we reviewed the differences between phasers and photon torpedoes and the difference in capabilities there. So without further ado, we also found a historical World War II analog from the Japanese Navy, kind of to the Akira. And this ship is called the Kitakami. And it's basically a light cruiser. And it has 40, and yes, I did say 40 Type 93 long lance torpedoes with the ability to reload, I believe. But I'll let Chris talk about this. So, Chris, go ahead and take it from here.
So I've got a little bit of a story. So Captain Carlson could probably do a much better. I know he can do a much better job talking about the history of this craft, etc. But I've got a story. So my friend Sean Barnett is a naval wargamer, and he was going to run a game at the Origins Wargaming convention that I helped him playtest. And so the idea behind the way this game worked is he put just generic ship models out, and he told everybody, these are generic ship models. When you actually are close enough that you can recognize the ship and you make a recognition roll, I'll be rolling the dice, and at some point you'll be close enough and you'll make a recognition roll, and I'll swap the models out. And so one of the ships was the Kitakami, which, you know, when you see this thing and you figure out exactly what it is, your immediate response is kill it now, kill it with fire. And so that's how we ended up doing it, because it's got 40 torpedo tubes all over the place, and it's really, really dangerous. I'll note, though, for what it's worth, I think wargamers do better against long lances than actual U.S. naval officers did, in part because we know that it exists, whereas U.S. naval officers did not know it exists and knew that they wanted to close the gun range. So it's a lot easier to shoot torpedoes at somebody that's basically all they're doing is trying to close the range with you. They're just moving it in straight lines, trying to close the range. It's easier to shoot that sort of target. So in any event, we played this scenario in my friend Wade Hinkle's basement. We tested all out. This is great. Sean's going to go off and play it at Origins. So he's got it set up at Origins, and he's playing. And the Americans have just made their recognition roll, and Sean puts out the model of the Kitakami. And he doesn't say anything. He just swaps it out. I mean, he's not hiding his actions. He just swaps it out. And, they have to sort of figure out what it is, but they haven't. They're busy talking. They haven't really noticed it yet. At this point, Chris's design partner, Larry Bond, who knows Sean, wanders by, says, "Hi, Sean. Oh, wow, a Kitakami. You don't see one of those every day," and then walks off. and all of the Americans go, "Kitakami? What's the kit? What's the big deal? That sounds kind of. Are those torpedo tubes? Oh my God!" And so, yeah, they got a tipper. They got an intelligence tipper that there was a torpedo cruiser out there. So, but I mean, Larry was in the zone of control for only 15 seconds, and it was just enough to sort of.
He does that.
He does do that. So
I think I saw Larry give a talk at Origins, and it might even have been that one where he was talking about war with Iran. So I don't know if it was the same year, but
that was probably either the Persian incursion discussion.
Yes, that was it. I was there.
Yeah,
that was later. Persian incursion was much, much later. This was
okay.
This might have been. This was actually probably in the 90s. This was probably before I had gone off to CNA. This was probably when I was still working for doing tech support for the internet software company.
All right. So, Captain Carlson, you want to give us a little background on the specifics of this ship for a few minutes?
Well, the Japanese were very concerned about, big gun battles. Yeah, they had a lot of air aficionados, but a lot of the admirals and whatnot still believed in the big gun, and they wanted to be able to break up the opposing line's battle line. And they thought their best way to do this would be to do saturation volleys from about 20,000 yards. And if you got a few hits, it would just completely screw up the opposing side's organizational structure, and you could then start picking onesies and twosies and pounding them into doll rags. So this thing would fire one set of torpedoes, do a quick turnaround, find another set, and then say, "Have fun, boys," and walk away. Now, mind you, this is basically 5 destroyers worth of torpedoes on a light cruiser, a World War I light cruiser, because it's pretty wimpy in comparison to a lot of World War II ones. This is like 5,200 tons, so it's not huge, but it was designed to basically just barf torpedoes and then withdraw.
Yeah, and for those who aren't familiar, the Japanese long lance torpedo was a very long range, very potent, very large explosive torpedo that the Americans didn't really know about. At the beginning of the war, the expectation was 4,000 or 5,000 yards for a torpedo normally, but the long lance torpedo had about a 20,000 yard range. Is that about right? Look.
Oh, it was about 40,000.
40,000 yard range. Okay. So it really outranged, and then the Japanese would attack at night. And so torpedoes don't have a big gun splash or anything. So if they kind of knew where you were, they could launch a bunch of torpedoes nice and quietly. And you didn't know the torpedoes were on their way as you try to engage the Japanese ships if you detected them. So, but they were well drilled at night combat tactics, certainly better than us at the beginning of the war.
And as these were oxygen propelled, they were wicked fast.
Yep.
So for what it's worth, there is a great video on the long lance done by Drachenfell, if you know him. Type 93 long lance torpedo, long range hole poking device. And so I'm putting the link in the chat. It's definitely worth watching. He does some really, really good work. Like he did a 3-part series on raising the ships at Pearl Harbor, because the some of those ships, like one of the ships that was put back in commission was basically turned over for like a year and a half, 2 years before they finally got her up. So it's really pretty good, but the long lance one is pretty much worth looking at.
Yeah. So Pat, just as a quick rundown, 22,000 yards at 49 knots, 44,000 yards at 37 knots.
Oh, okay.
So yeah,
Jet lost 2 knots.
Well, no, you went from 49 to 37.
To 37. I'm sorry, I heard you wrong. Okay.
So that's what but if you're looking to form your gun line around 18 to 20,000 yards, this thing could just shoot out 49 knot torpedoes.
Wow. Yeah, it definitely an impressive capability. But they only built what you said, 2 or 3 of these, right?
They were going to build 3. Kiso was not modified, and Kitakami and her sister Oi didn't really fulfill their roles, and because the Japanese kind of found out that when you shoot from really far away, your probability of hit really goes down even against a long battle line. So they revised all their torpedo tactics to come in much closer, basically to what Chris said earlier. And if you've ever read the book on the Japanese destroyer captain, he rewrote their torpedo tactics because all the long-range shooting proved ineffective.
Okay. Gotcha. I think I read that book in college. So.
I don't want to tell you how long that was.
All right. So basically the point of this is just there is kind of a historical precedent for a torpedo, a torpedo-focused type vessel. And so the Akira is essentially Starfleet's version of it, though presumably more effective. So it does have several advantages, and then we'll also talk about some of the disadvantages. Over here in this picture, you can see him fighting the Borg cube. You can see an Akira way back there. We've got another Akira, I believe, right here, and then there's a Norway and a couple sabers here in the up closer, and then some poor guy down here probably getting tractor beamed and killed. So. So obviously its biggest, most prominent advantage probably is a large photon torpedo load. But what they do is they flip the standard weapon load essentially on its head compared to most other ships. Like we compared it to the Galaxy. The Galaxy has phasers that can fire in all different directions, whereas this thing is loaded with photon torpedoes that can face in all different directions. Which, since photon torpedoes have longer range than phasers, it gives the Akira an outstanding long-range firepower. And of course, photon torpedoes probably, or generally, we believe, have a much higher punch than phasers themselves. So it really makes its weaponry very suited to destroying enemy threat vessels, rather than just targeting a specific spot on an enemy ship and taking out the engines and weapons. This thing has the capability to kill things when it needs to. So it's definitely got a lot of firepower. The next thing is its next advantage is basically unprecedented, combat power at warp. So photon torpedoes being warp capable weapons, and phasers are generally not considered to be very useful at warp. That means a ship like the Galaxy is going to lose an awful lot of its firepower when it goes to warp. It's only going to have its forward and aft photon torpedo tubes. The Akira has torpedo tubes facing in all different directions, and so that means it can fight at warp. And with a top speed of 9.8. It means it can intercept somebody crossing the Federation border, and if they know it's hostile, it can engage them at warp. And one of the things we typically see is that whenever an enemy vessel is approaching, people tend to drop out of warp. So they don't really like to fight at warp that much. We don't really get a good clue on what disadvantages there are at warp necessarily. Maybe it causes a little more damage. Maybe, even like in Babylon 5, they talk about they don't like, fighting in hyperspace. It's generally a bad idea. There's some of that in the Honorverse. And so by the next generation, they generally don't fight at warp, though we did see quite a few in the original series, where they fight at warp. And additionally, if Akira needs to escape, it's got 6 aft photon torpedo tubes. So that means if you're running and somebody is chasing you, your torpedoes can actually get a much greater range. And the fact that it's pretty fast means it could probably lure an opponent, make them think they're catching up to Akira, and then sit there at longer range and fight it. So 6 torpedo tubes aft, maybe 8, depending on which model you're using. And even if the Akira can only fire 2 torpedoes per tube, and that's kind of where I believe, and Chris and I have discussed this a little bit, that's kind of where I believe it would be at with this, though it certainly could be more. It would have greater firepower than the Galaxy class, as far as being able to throw torpedoes aft. All right. The next thing is it would have the ability to do multi-system security and surveillance. So basically what I'm trying to say is the Akira could be out on the frontiers of the Federation, and it could be responsible for patrolling a pretty large area and maintaining some basic level of security and protection within some far-flung colonies. So it could hop around at high speed between different star systems, and it could drop off detachments of fighters and a runabout to support those fighters with additional personnel and supplies, communication support. And then the Akira could rotate through the various systems and help maintain and replace ships and that kind of stuff. The other thing is with a runabout is kind of a multi-mission configurable ship also. It can carry a weapons pod, a sensor pod, probably a jamming pod, or maybe even extra communications pods. But they do have weapon pods, and we do see that in Deep Space Nine. And it can even do a light strike roll, and it can fight, though it's probably not its strength there. But supporting a group of peregrines, perhaps it could help enhance their sensor picture, improve their situational awareness, and that sort of thing. So the other one is that with the additional torpedo tubes, it's probably got a pretty great capability to launch probes, which there are, if you look in the technical manual, there are multiple types of, there's jamming, communication probes, all sorts of sensor and surveillance probes, and intel gathering probes that it can launch. So it can also monitor multiple star systems this way by replenishing those probes as they go down. Mr. Carlson, any comments or anything like that? Those are pretty much the advantages. We'll move into the disadvantages here in a moment. All right. So as far as the disadvantages go, it's got the one phaser strip on the top and two smaller phaser strips on the bottom. So it doesn't have the phaser coverage. So it doesn't have the close-in combat capability probably that some of the other Federation ships like the Galaxy class does. So it's got essentially a minimal amount of phasers, but it's certainly no slouch. It's probably got half of the phaser strip on the top of the Akira is probably about half of that of the Galaxy class. And the only other thing is that since most of its weaponry is photon torpedoes, there are indications that you don't want to shoot somebody really, really close to you when you don't want to hit a target ship too close when you fire your photon torpedoes, because some of that damage can hit you too. But it would have to be awfully close, I would imagine. The other thing is its peregrine fighters could potentially offset the phaser disadvantage by, guarding blind spots on the Akira and such.
The only comment I would have, Pat, and we've talked about this, is that supposedly the Akira has 6 phaser emitter strips.
Yes, yeah, that's in the books. Haven't found them on the models, but I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the Eagle Moss, I think the Eagle Moss model is probably the best. And while we've discussed that maybe, you've seen pictures that looks like Greeblies, I'm going to attach that to unknowing digital artists, because Eagle Moss really makes those 2 strips, they look like phaser strips, and they're in a good place to cover the arcs in the port, starboard, aft area.
Yep.
I can't find the 6th one. If I had my druthers, I'd put it on the underside of the weapons pod, because that would allow then better coverage aft behind the main hull. So I'll say this much: she probably has similar coverage, but she doesn't have the punch of a Galaxy.
Right. Yep, I tend to agree with that. So one of the other disadvantages of this is that once you launch your fighters into combat, the decision to launch those fighters into harm's way probably can't be taken lightly. I mean, it depends on the situation. If you're in a major fleet battle trying to save the entire quadrant, then of course you're going to take chances. But if the tactical situation were to change for an Akira class ship with its fighters in the air or off the ship, the captain might be faced with the choice of leaving the fighters behind to save the ship, to retreat, or risking the ship while the fighters are recovered, staying in a bad situation while you try to land fighters. So Akira's, and I would imagine that their maneuverability while trying to land fighters and recover fighters would be fairly limited. So that might make them vulnerable to incoming fire. So then there would be the potential capability of recovering fighters at warp, and potentially under combat conditions. So the fact that Peregrine fighters are warp capable would also offer the possibility that everybody could retreat separately from a bad situation, and they could meet up at a different location, at a location a little farther away, and possibly and recover. And again, Akira's ability to fight at warp might dissuade anybody from trying to chase them. So,
have we seen anything that indicates how many tractor emitters they have?
No. And for anyone who hadn't seen it last week, I mean, an awful lot of this is speculative. There is not a lot of really, truly canon level data for the Akira. So we're inferring an awful lot in this talk.
And what data we have has a tendency to be somewhat contradictory, because there's at least 3 different models of the ship that we know of. They don't appear to all be, and that's not including the Eagle Moss physical model. So there's 4. They don't appear to be at the same scale. Nobody can tell us how long the ship is. So there's lots of, you can always try to do window analysis, but window analysis is,
Well, and actually, I'll back up here. If you look at these, we see the Jem'Hadar battle cruisers here. They are supposed to be huge, right? But if you look right here, here's a steam runner. And you can see that steam runner is on the other side of this Dominion battle cruiser, and steam runners are not supposed to be very big. So I would call this a special effects mistake, rather than saying, no, either the Jem'Hadar battle cruisers are really small or the steam runners are really huge. They don't have the appearance of being a really huge ship. So they do get that stuff wrong every now and then in the series.
Yeah. So the reason why I ask about tractor emitters is because if you think that tractor beams can be used at warp, then at least part of the deal is you could perhaps, snag fighters and sort of drag them along with you and pull them in one at a time as you're doing a drive-by through the formation.
That's certainly possible. There was a game that we have talked about, and Chris will recognize this tactic. It was called death dragging, where you would put a tractor beam on a fighter or a shuttle and yank it at a speed faster than it can go, and you basically kill it. It was a favorite tactic at times. I remember doing that to some Hydran fighters at one point at a tournament. So
that's crass.
He launched them a little too close to me. But it was made for a fun game, though, for me.
Appreciate the clarification.
Just trying to be accurate. Another thing with the Akira is it's possible that, and some of this is me trying to think up, because if it's got all these amazing capabilities, somewhere they have to give up something. So this is kind of speculative, but one of the big things is everything is a tactical trade-off. And what that means is space is at a premium on a starship. And actually, as Chris said today, which I like, the inside of the ship cannot be bigger than the outside of the ship. So you can't have more stuff on it. And we have seen an example of the inside of the ship being way larger than the outside of the ship in one of the recent shows. But much of Akira's internal volume and crew is dedicated to that hangar and its flight operations, engineer, and possibly to engineering. And you've got 15 to 17 photon torpedo tubes. So you're talking weapons handling, storage, maintenance, and then of both the torpedoes and the launchers. So that's going to, and since it's a combat ship primarily, you're going to have a larger combat staff or tactical staff on board the ship. So it's possible that they have a smaller Marine or security detachment on board in case, angry Klingons ever board the ship and try to take it over, since they did fight a war. So that's one possibility. But the point is that space and crew are limited. It's considered to have a crew of about 500 people. And if most of that crew is dedicated to weapons and tactical type things, and you've got the hangar, the weapons, the ammo storage for both the ship and for the fighters. They carry those micro photon torpedoes and stuff. So we're talking about a lot of space dedicated to this stuff, which means a lot of people dedicated to this stuff. So that may not leave enough, very many people left over for research laboratories and arboretums, and certainly there are no families aboard this ship. And the other thing is all these photon torpedoes and supporting a fighter group is going to require logistical support in a protracted combat situation. So they're going to need resupply to match the tempo of combat. Torpedoes are expendable, and you can expect that they probably take some casualties within their fighter squadron. So if you want to maintain its combat capability, it's going to need support. And my belief, and I don't know what you guys think about this, but my belief is that it probably really doesn't have the endurance, let's say, of a Galaxy class ship. Any comments on logistics or the support part of things?
When you cram a lot of equipment inside a hull, maintenance becomes more difficult. Particularly if as we've seen a lot of Star Trek episodes, they do a lot of block upgrades out of nowhere at times. And, cutting through that hull ain't the easiest thing to do. So wherever you cram in a lot of stuff, you have to be able to get back at it to fix it, because it will break. I mean, moving parts break. So, and I don't think I want moving parts breaking when it's trying to move antimatter, to be quite honest.
Oh, yeah. Yes, exactly. So all of these phenomenal combat capabilities probably don't come cheap. Now, they may not use money, but the Federation still requires resources to build these vessels. So the economics in the Federation is left fairly vague, but building a ship is going to cost something. Duranium, antimatter, trained personnel, just to name a few things. So it's a lot of capabilities crammed into the ship. So it's going to come at a price. And basically, there's a saying I've heard. You can have something fast, you can have it cheap, or it can be really high quality, but you can't have all three. And so somewhere there's a price to be paid for this. So, it can maybe it's super duper high quality, but that probably doesn't come cheaply. And let's see. And one of the other advantages, I suppose, is that it also has armor plating on the hull, provides some additional protection. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some different combat options that the Akira could engage in. Okay, so first, in single combat, chances are Akira is a more powerful ship than probably most other individual threat vessels that are out there. So it could just fight an opposing ship on its own. And so even though it doesn't use its fighters, it has a little bit less firepower. But it also means if Akira is worried about, perhaps the tactical situation changing, maybe it's a trap, they can warp out of the situation fairly quickly if they need to. Or it can just launch gobs of torpedoes at the single target that it's at and that it's fighting, and take it out from long range before it even gets a chance to respond. As we've talked about, Cardassian ships typically use beam weapons and not torpedo weapons. And so one of the things we were speculating is maybe Akira was a response to the Cardassian War, where the Cardassians didn't really use a lot of photon torpedoes. So the next option potentially for Akira is that and when I show this enemy vessel, that could be any enemy vessel, it could be a group of vessels. But the other one is that it could launch its fighter force, and the fighters could hang out outside enemy enemy weapon range, and just create basically a barrier between the enemy force and Akira, while Akira hits it with long-range weaponry. In this way, the fighters kind of stay safe, but they help support Akira, make it harder for the enemy to get close to the Akira itself, while Akira hits the bad guy with a bunch of long-range torpedoes. So BARCAP is barrier cap, and CAP is combat air patrol. So it gets abbreviated BARCAP. The fighters would basically stay outside of effective enemy weapon range, and the fighters protect Akira from attack from the enemy force. And certainly they could always be used as a reaction or a reserve force against any changes that occur during the battle. Okay, so one of the next possible tactical options is a fighter strike. Akira could could conduct operations farther away. It could just launch the fighters as a strike against the enemy by itself. And the fighters could handle the enemy while Akira stays safe, or like I said, handles another mission. In this case, the fighters would be leading the strike against an opponent, or Akira could just provide some long-range support, and that support could come in the form of jamming. It could launch jamming probes. It could lob torpedoes at the target, and maybe weaken the target a little bit for the fighters to go in. But this way, it doesn't risk itself. Now, one of the other potential tactics, I called it sensor blinding, and what this would be is this would be another way to support the fighters, whereas the fighters are going in, Akira could launch a lot of torpedoes in between the target and the fighters, obviously far enough ahead of the fighters so they don't blow up the fighters themselves, but with the goal of disrupting the enemy sensors. And if they can disrupt the enemy sensors, then the fighters might get in close to the target and score some first strikes before they get a chance to destroy any of the fighters. So, and we saw this tactic from the Deep Space Nine episode, Once More Unto the Breach, where the Klingon Dahar Master, he fires a spread of torpedoes to blind the sensors of a superior Jem'Hadar force. And all this was going to do was buy a few seconds, but when you're talking about the speeds that they're flying around at, a few seconds could make all the difference. And if that lets you get in the first strike, then you might damage the enemy ship badly enough that you don't take any casualties, or your casualties are minimal. So this tactic could be used to help protect fighters, or it could be used to protect maybe a friendly vessel who's wounded and damaged and needs time to escape the battle, and Akira could provide that kind of support. All right. So the next one would be torpedo fire support. And what this basically is kind of saying is they're in a fleet battle, and in this case we see a Saber attacking a Cardassian ship. It gets in close. It fires its torpedoes and its phasers to damage and weaken the shields on the Cardassian ship. The red shield here represents a really weak shield. The blue would be up, and the black shield here would represent a down shield. So Whereas in this other saber here, he's managed to lower the shields on the Cardassian ships. And then that gets timed, since Akira has all-around photon torpedo capability, right? They could time those attacks so that the bulk of Akira's torpedoes are landing on the target just as the shields get knocked down before the enemy ship has time to maneuver out of the way. Now, this kind of coordination would require practice and training and all sorts of stuff, and it would probably be difficult to pull off. But this is another way you could use the Akira. These could be planned strikes or strikes of opportunity, potentially to finish off enemy ships. And meanwhile, and of course, its fighters could go in and do some of the attacks as well. And Akira could also be supported by some of its own fighters. But this is another way to make use of Akira's capabilities while keeping it perhaps not as risky a situation. And then the other one would be, it's just a big, ugly dogfight. And so I just call it the Brawler option. So this option envisions Akira just going into the thick of the fight with its fighters. They fly in together so they can give each other mutual support. The phasers can cover any phaser blind spots on Akira or act as a force multiplier up close, while the Akira is firing off torpedoes at various targets. And because it's in the middle of the fight, it can fire aft torpedoes and side torpedoes and forward torpedoes. It can just hand out torpedoes to everybody. So, some closing thoughts on the Akira here. So it's definitely a warship. I don't believe it's got gardens, and it probably doesn't have as many holodecks. And so some of those, if you get rid of those creature comforts on board the ship, it probably means it doesn't have the range. Like they talk about the Galaxy being built to go on a 20-year mission if it really needs to, or really long duration missions and stuff. I don't think Akira has that kind of duration. It's meant to fight, and when it's in a fight, to fight well, but then it's going to need its support. Couple additional features that the ship has. Now, I put a question mark by the 2 warp cores, and we'll talk about that in a second. So it might have 2 warp cores. That's that's speculation. It's a debatable issue. And it's got some armor plating in addition to some of the other stuff that we've talked about. And you could be forgiven for believing it's kind of a fanboy super ship. Like, we've all seen some of the ships where a big Star Trek fan or Battlestar Galactica fan starts designing some ships that, make the Galactica look like this tiny little minor carrier compared to some of these monstrosities that some people make and stuff like that. So when I first read it, I kind of thought, yeah, this is too powerful. It's too much of a super ship. And sometimes it's referred to as an escort or a heavy cruiser. So my belief is that for it not to be a super ship and super crazy is that all these combat capabilities it has come at a cost in some other capability. I had a wise instructor once say everything is a tactical trade-off. So there's no free lunch, even in Star Trek. So every capability uses up weight and space and power or crew to operate. And so all of those things would use up some of those capabilities. And so probably no labs, no families, less endurance, smaller crew quarters, less recreational facilities, probably less storage for raw matter for its replicators. So, and then since we've talked about naming and classification, I just kind of proposed that maybe Akira is a battle cruiser, as it's very fast. Maybe it doesn't have the, in Deep Space Nine, we do see a couple of Akiras getting killed. The only Galaxy class we see get killed is the Odyssey. And the Galaxies are clearly up close and in the fight. So that's about all I got. Any questions or anything?
So the one thing that comes to my mind, Pat, is that in none of the examples that you give is the Akira and its fighter complement dealing with enemy fighters.
That's true. And we did see lots of, essentially, the Hideki, the smaller Cardassian ship. I see it as kind of I see that as a little larger than the Peregrines. I think they're more on scale with the Jem'Hadar attack ships and stuff like that too. So, and we don't see any Klingon fighters. The only other fighters we see are the Romulan Scorpions, which are little two-man craft. But those seem especially tiny. And I'll quote Andy here, and he suggests that maybe those things aren't necessarily meant to be used against starships. Maybe they go down to the planet and help enforce whatever the Romulans want done on down planet side and support troops and stuff like that. So, but again, we don't have any good information on that one.
I could, there's part of me. I've thought, for instance, I mean, there's a debate about whether this is designed against the Cardassians or whether it's designed in the Dominion or whether it's designed against the Borg. I have a tendency to think that the photon torpedo portion of it is an indication it's designed against the Borg because we see that episode, the first episode with the Borg cube basically runs down the Enterprise. What better way to deal with a superior firepower Borg cube than to have a bunch of rearward firing photon torpedo tubes that you can shoot at the thing as it's trying to run you down, especially since you're going to de facto increase the range of your photon torpedoes by it happening, right? You're just whipping them out the back and it's running into them as it's coming after you, right?
Yep.
So it's really going to make it, it's actually more effective to shoot them out the back at something that's trying to run you down from behind.
Yeah.
And then, so it seems to me that from that standpoint, that really sort of says anti-Borg to me. But, maybe the fighter part is really just sort of a twofer on the part of the Starfleet designers. On the one hand, we can use those to go and deal with all that little crappy Cardassian stuff if we need to deal with that. And so they can be useful for dealing with situations like that. And then, if we decide that we do want to actually try to send this out on a science mission or something like that, we can offload the fighters and onload some other systems that are better designed for that research and exploration mission. The comment's been made that an aircraft carrier, what differentiates an aircraft carrier from a battleship is that you can upgrade an aircraft carrier. You fly off the old planes, you fly planes. In effect, you've got a new aircraft carrier in terms of its combat capability. So, from that standpoint, I can sort of see this is a case of they've optimized against two different threats, and they've given the operational planners an ability to buy back some of that warfare capability for peacetime missions if they need to.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Chris?
Well, just the one that we've talked about real quick is the two warp cores. Okay, I've heard people say it's for redundancy. And trying to think of how you would cross-connect and merge plasma streams just leaves me very queasy.
We should actually, at some point, we need to get you and Andy on at the same time. Andy suffers from the fact that, well, let me rephrase that. Andy is blessed with 2 children under 4.
Cursed is a good word.
Blessed. So the end result of that is that Andy's really tough to get on a Saturday night because he's generally just exhausted.
Yeah.
But his thinking on this is that when they're both up and running, they're basically, it's pulsed plasma. It's not a constant stream. So there's basically pulses of plasma going through, and the warp cores are designed to basically alternate so that they're taking turns. And I get where that look's coming from, because that's the sort of thing that these days, when you don't have computer cores that are operating within subspace fields, so they're actually processing it faster than light speeds, if you don't have that stuff, that sounds like it's an insurmountable problem, but maybe it's not for Starfleet.
Well, we know that the Enterprise D can kick plasma. What was it? 12.75 million terawatts.
Something like that.
That was the True Q episode. What was that? It was the girl Q, the female Q, Amanda, and Data told her, "Oh, we're operating here. Come on, guys. You don't need a redundant power supply when you're talking millions of terawatts."
Yeah, kind of, especially in a situation where if you were taking damage, I suppose I could see a situation where you took some damage and you had to eject a warp core, or you had to shut a warp core down, and having a hot spare would be useful, right? Hey, USS Enterprise CVN 65, 8 reactors.
Yeah, I know that was power driven.
Well, and reactors were new, and they wanted to make sure that they had some redundancy built in, just in case.
Yeah, there was a couple of spares.
Yeah. I had heard someplace that when they record those reactors later on, the power density of the cores increased, and they didn't recore all of them.
I hadn't heard that.
I don't know where I heard that. I have no reason to think that that's an authoritative source, and I can't remember if I asked my my cubicle mate, the Surface Nuke, if he had heard that.
I could see where they wouldn't recore all of them with the new cores if that was a problem.
Yeah.
But I can't see just having 2 reactors, just full of water.
So for what it's worth, Mark loved that plant. As a Surface Nuke, he loved that plant. Because he said you can send steam from any reactor to any part on the ship that needs steam by just, closing the right valves. Now, if I were the main propulsion assistant on that ship, I would not be happy, because that's a really old, cranky steam plant that's just leaking like a sieve all the time.
Probably be taken off in an I Love Me jacket.
Yeah. Yeah, I knew somebody who was MPA on Enterprise. And
oh, God.
He was
steam generators.
Yeah. So it was considered a get well tour. So a get well tour, for those who haven't heard the term, is sometimes a naval officer, for no fault of his own, has a bad tour, and so you can get well by taking a really, really crappy tour and doing well at it. And so it's like, that's sort of their way of giving you an opportunity to prove, no, really, it wasn't my fault the last time. I am a good guy. You should keep me. So, but oh well. So we're at the stopping point. Does anybody have any final rounds? Any saved rounds?
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thank you for joining us.
Star Trek fan?
Say again?
Is Larry a Star Trek fan?
I don't know. He's a Star Trek fan. I don't think he's played any of the games. As I recall, I didn't see Starfleet battles or Federation and Empire in his locker. He had lots of Traveler. He was a big Traveler guy.
I can see that. I've got a few amount of Traveler stuff myself. In fact, at one point, I certainly had everything GDW ever published on Traveler, and I was really close to having everything that had ever been published on Traveler that wasn't in like a magazine.
Well, see, nowadays it's real easy because they're offering a complete library on CD.
Yeah, well, I mean, even before that, I had everything in Dead Tree Edition. Then they did the large format reprints, and I bought everything in the large format reprint. Then I bought it all on CD. So for a lot of that stuff, and then I got rid of my little black books when I got it all in the big reprint stuff. When I got it in the big reprint.
It's heresy.
Yeah, I know. Speaking of heresy, I like 40K too.
I don't do 40K.
I can understand. 40K is one of those things. None of it makes even the least amount of sense. It's I love the texture and everything, but none of it makes any sense. So, all right, I think it's time.
I'm probably going to have to try and twist Larry's arm to come on.
That sounds good. We'd love to have him.
Yeah,
love to have him. So the more the merrier. We're limited to 10 people, including Lissa.
Okay, we're good.
So we can have a group. Yeah, somebody's saying don't let Alec hear that. So, but hopefully Alec will be back and joining us soon. Hopefully he'll get decent internet connectivity in the near future. Because as it is, he's still at the point where he has to go home, or he has to go to the studio if he wants to actually have a decent internet connection. So.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Yuck.
Yeah, it's bad. But oh well. First world problems if there ever was one.
Truly.
Truly. All right, then. I think it's time to say goodnight. So thank you very much, everybody. See you next week.
Good night, everybody. We'll see you.